change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
Up until now, Jesus has been saying, my time has not come, it's not my time, but now his time has come. And this day was actually prophesied to the very exact date when the Messiah would enter into Jerusalem to reveal himself to Israel. And that prophecy came about 500 years before this date. It's all the way back to the book of Daniel, when the prophet Daniel wrote about it. You can find that in Daniel chapter 9, 20. And when you get to verse 25, it says that the angel Gabriel tells Daniel, it says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. All right. But we also know the date of that command, because that date is given to us in the book of Ezra. And so that date had actually been written down. And that actual date is March 14th, 445 BC. That was the day that King Cyrus, the king of Persia, gave the command to restore the temple. So if you add all these weeks up and you convert it to days, that'll bring you to April 6, 32 AD. And that is this exact date where Jesus, he rode into Jerusalem on the donkey's colt right here. And he presents himself as the Messiah. And so this is a day of fulfilling prophecy, and we read one here that's quoted. And he knows that he's going to be fulfilling this prophecy in Zechariah 9:9, that he's going to be riding into Jerusalem on a donkey's colt. And so what he does is he sends 2 of his disciples to the village to go loose the colt. And Jesus, he already knows that they're going to send it because it's already been prearranged. It's been prearranged by God. And so they bring this donkey and then his colt, and they make this makeshift saddle out of their clothes. You have to realize, Jesus, he wasn't riding that donkey because he was tired. They have walked all the way from Galilee. And now this is the last 2 miles. And this last 2 miles is all downhill. The only reason Jesus rode this colt was to show that he was humble and that he was coming in peace as a king. Because donkeys used to be the ride of royalty at peacetime before King Solomon started bringing in all the horses. Now, Rome, if Rome was looking at this and they saw Jesus, they wouldn't really think of him much of a conquering king coming on a little donkey's colt, and they would have laughed at him. This would have been a joke. They wouldn't be threatened. Not Caesar, not Pilate. And of all these people around him, there probably wouldn't have even been one sword among them. But this crowd on this hillside going into Jerusalem, it would have been absolutely huge. Now, the city of Jerusalem, it had a population yearly of usually about 100,000 people. But at the Passover, the population swelled to about 2 million people. And so you already have all these people that were following Jesus all the way down from Galilee, right? And then you also have the pilgrims who are bringing their sacrifices to the Passover. And that was required by law. That's why the city swelled so high. They would have been bringing their lambs. So there'd be all these sheep and all those lambs, that were going to be sacrificed for the Passover. They would have had to have been with them for 3 days because that was required that the lamb would have to live with them for at least 3 days prior to being offered. But then you also have all these people coming with Jesus from Bethany. Because even though we don't read it here in Matthew, Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead. So probably Lazarus was coming with them and the sisters were coming with them. But it also says that people were going to meet Jesus because they wanted to meet Jesus and Lazarus, who he raised from the dead. So you got all these people and you got all these animals and they're filling the streets. And it's a spontaneous parade that just breaks out. And people, they're laying their cloaks into the road, and they're cutting down palm branches. And the palm branch was the sign of Israel's nationalism. And that had become their symbol from the Maccabean period. So there was probably this great anticipation, wondering if this is the time that Jesus is going to deliver Israel from Roman rule. Then all these people, they start singing out Psalm 118:26. And they all knew it because the book of Psalms was the Jews' psalm book. And so they all start singing this messianic song that was actually written for this day, because that whole psalm is about Jesus. And they sang Hosanna, which means save now, because they're thinking that he's going to save them from Rome. And then they would shout out Jesus' messianic title, Son of David. And they all knew exactly what they were singing, but so did the religious leaders. And so this Palm Sunday, this triumphal entry, is what caused the religious leaders to have such an urgency to go and destroy Jesus, and to do it quickly. And so Jesus, he would be betrayed, and he would be crucified within the next 5 days. But it isn't because of the religious leaders. It's because it was already predetermined that the Christ, that the Lamb of God was to be killed on the Passover. And that's because this is God's will. And so now you have all these people, and even though they're rejoicing here, Jesus himself, he's crying uncontrollably. But he's not crying for himself. But what he knows is that these people, they are going to reject him, and it's going to cause them to be separated from him. It's going to separate Israel from God as a nation. But even though this looks like a bunch of chaos, God is in control. And so that gives us hope, because just like today, it seems like we have a lot of chaos. And I'll tell you that the closer we get to the second coming of Christ, it's going to be a lot more chaos. But the thing we need to realize is that God, that he's still in control, and that we can trust him. So if anybody here, they need peace, and you can't find it anywhere, you come up here and we'll pray for you. Jesus, he can give you peace today, but it's like Bartimaeus and the other guy. You have to ask him, and he will. So this is a continuation. It's the same day as last week when we studied the triumphal entry that we looked at. So now Jesus, he's coming down off the hillside, and he goes into the temple of God. And where he actually goes is into the court of the Gentiles, where they have set up this marketplace. And this court of the Gentiles, this was the only place that a non-Jew could go to worship the true God of Israel, at the temple. And to go any further than this court, a Gentile would be killed. But this court of the Gentiles, it was not created to keep Gentiles out. It was created to allow Gentiles to participate in the true worship of the holy God of Israel, who is the only God of all the nations. Because the very next line of what Jesus quoted here out of Isaiah 56, he says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." But the very next line, if you read it, it would say, "for all nations." So this is the place, this court of the Gentiles is the place that God made for the nations to worship him. And it's because God loves the Gentiles just as much as he loves the Jews. But now in this court of the Gentiles, they've now filled it up with live oxen and sheep, and they have cages filled with doves and pigeons. And then they have all these tables set up there to exchange currency. Because if you came with foreign coins and you came from all these various countries, they weren't acceptable in the temple. The only acceptable coinage to the priests of the temple would be the Tyre shekel, which is still really a foreign currency because Tyre was a country north of Israel. But they also knew the purity of the silver in the Tyre shekel, and it didn't have the same idols that the Roman currency had. But it wasn't pure. It was pagan still. And how this all started was probably as a service for the Jews who had to travel far, who lived outside of Jerusalem and lived in other countries. So instead of having to bring your offering, your sheep and your oxen, or whatever you wanted to sacrifice at the temple, you could just bring some money. And you could buy whatever you needed there. So you could go there and you could buy an ox, you could buy a lamb, you could buy a pair of doves, whatever you wanted to sacrifice. But over time, the temple had become such big business, and there was so much profit to be gained making these kinds of exchanges of currencies and by selling the animals. It only made good sense because this was good business. So now, if you wanted to buy an animal, it would cost you 3 times more to buy one inside the temple. But that animal, that would be a priest-approved animal. Because the animal that you probably brought from your home, it may not pass the priest's inspection. Because every sacrifice, every animal, it had to be blemish-free according to the law of Moses. And when they looked over your animal, and they would look your animal over real good, because they would look it over until they could find a blemish. But on theirs, they don't see any blemishes, not on theirs. And so now, if you just wanted to buy a pair of doves would cost you 20 times more than what you would have paid outside the temple. And the sad thing about this is that the doves, well, that was a provision that God made for the poor, because that was made for the poor who couldn't afford a lamb to sacrifice. So now these poor people, they're being gouged by paying these exorbitant prices, and this is all at the direction of the priests. And all of this is happening in the court of the Gentiles. So now there's no room for any Gentiles to be able to come in because the court was all filled with merchandise. So now instead of people worshiping and smelling the fragrance of the incense and of the sacrifice, you'd have the smell of a barnyard, and the smells that come with livestock. And instead of having an atmosphere of meaningful prayers and the songs of meditation, well, now you have the sounds of an auctioneer making a deal in the loud, obnoxious bargaining between the two parties. And in that culture, in the Middle East culture, it was very loud and very animated, any deal that you made. And so there would be no way you'd be able to hear any meaningful prayer. And they still bargain that way. If you go to Israel, they still bargain that way today. They're very loud. And here it says Jesus is not only driving out the sellers, but he's also driving out the buyers too. Because everybody who's doing business in this area of the temple, they're all at fault. And so you would see that this would be an impossible place to be able to worship in and to be able to stand there in the presence of God if there was any room for you to squeeze in to be able to stand at all. Because these Jewish leaders, they cared much more about the profits they made and about their animals than they ever cared about Gentiles seeking the God of Israel. Now, this is the second time that Jesus has gone into the temple and to cleanse it. The first time he did it was in the very beginning of his ministry, and you can read that in John's Gospel in chapter 2. So now this is a little more than 3 years later. But after the first time, and Jesus had thrown all the furniture out then, all they did is just bring it all back in again. And that's also what they're going to do after this cleansing of the temple. But in a lot of people's minds, you have this picture of Jesus making this whip and driving all these animals out, knocking over the tables with the doves on them, and there's doves flying everywhere. But that's not what happened here. Jesus drove out the people. It says Jesus turned over the money changers' tables. He didn't turn over the tables with the doves on them. He only turned over the seats of the people who sold the doves. He was only turning over their chairs. So there was no animals injured here. Jesus didn't hurt any of the animals. And so now Jesus, after he kicks them all out, he quotes Isaiah 56:7. And he calls this temple his house, my house. And this whole chapter from Isaiah 56 that he quotes, it's about Israel's unfaithful leaders. And then Jesus, he goes on and he calls them a den of thieves, which is exactly the same term that Jeremiah called the unfaithful leaders in his day in Jeremiah 7:11. And in that chapter of Jeremiah, God tells Jeremiah how he destroyed Shiloh, and that was because of their evil leaders. And Shiloh was the place in Israel that God had first put his name, where he put his tabernacle. And that's where all the sacrifices were done, just like it's done in Jerusalem now. But God destroyed Shiloh, and that was because of the unfaithful leaders. And so now, and at that time, Shiloh was a ruins. And that's exactly what's going to happen to this temple in Jerusalem. It'll also become a ruins because God is going to destroy it. And it's all going to happen within 40 years. All right, so now, with all the animals gone and all the buyers and the sellers gone, the people start coming back in because now there's room for them. And the people that come in is the blind and the lame. And that's because this is the only place in the temple that they could go also. And Jesus, he starts to heal them. And the chief priests and the elders here, they're all watching all of this. And it says right here in the scripture where you're reading, it says, the things Jesus was doing were wonderful things. So they were watching Jesus do these wonderful things. And you have to notice, even after Jesus throwing out all these people and having this outburst of righteous anger, that nobody's afraid to go up to him. And neither are the children, because there's all these children here, and they saw all this. And so now they're starting to sing out the words of Psalm 118. And again, that's the same song that they were singing to him as Jesus rode on the donkey's coat down the Mount of Olives. And so I imagine all these kids, they're seeing Jesus as this kind of superhero, that he's already beat up and cast out the bad guys, and now he's using these superpowers to heal the blind and the lame people. And these kids, they have no problem with seeing Jesus as their Messiah. It's easy for them to sing his praises now. But this causes those priests to become indignant because they don't see Jesus the same way that the kids do. And they don't want these children singing to him because they're singing a messianic psalm about him. They don't want to hear those children sing those things to Jesus. But Jesus, he receives the children's praise. And the reason is because he is the Messiah. That is who he is. And he is not hiding it. And so Jesus, he talks to these priests in a way that nobody has ever talked to them before. And then he says to them, again, which he always says to them, have you not read? And then Jesus, he goes on and he quotes Psalm 8, verse 2, where it talks about God had ordained praise from the children and silencing his enemies. And that's exactly what had just happened in this scene. Now you have to realize these priests, they didn't have a problem with children singing the praises of the rabbis that they approved of, because children back then were often employed to shout great things about their celebrity rabbis. And so after this scene, Jesus, he leaves. He goes back over the hill the same way that he came, over the Mount of Olives, and he goes back to Bethany. That's exactly where he had started that day, and he spends the evening with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And we'll never read, and we've never read, about Jesus ever spending the night in the city of Jerusalem. And at this time, this city would have been very crowded. It would have been very difficult to be able to find lodging in it. But the real reason I think that Jesus goes back to Bethany, it wasn't because he couldn't find lodging. It's because back in Bethany, he's loved there. And he enjoyed being with his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And then there's also a guy named Simon. He's also there with the disciples, because this is Jesus's last week on earth as a man. And he wants to spend it as much as he can with all these people that he loves. So now it's the next day, and Jesus, he walks over the hill again, but this time there's no parade. It's just Jesus and the disciples. And it's morning, and he's hungry, and there's a fig tree on the side of the road, and it has these luscious leaves. And it's like it's advertising that it has this fruit on it, because this type of fig tree, it didn't bear leaves without having fruit on it. Though in Mark's gospel, it says that this isn't the time of year for figs. But this tree looked like it should have fruit on it. But when Jesus looked, it had nothing. It had no fruit. And so Jesus, he cursed the trees and he says, let no fruit grow on you ever again. And so it makes you wonder, you say, well, is Jesus mad at the tree? If he knew there wouldn't be fruit on that tree because of the time of year, why is Jesus looking for fruit? And so it makes you think, well, what's the purpose of this event? Well, I think that Jesus knew that there wasn't any fruit on that tree, but that Jesus here, that he wanted to make a point, because he's going to do this like it's a living parable. And I don't think this point has anything to really do with fig trees or fruit, but it had to do with Israel. Because God had always spoke of Israel, of being his fig tree. That's mentioned in Jeremiah 8:13, and it's also mentioned in Hosea 9:10. And in Hosea, it says, I saw your fathers as the first fruits of the fig tree in its first season. And Jesus, he had already previously taught a parable in Luke 13 about a man who owned a fig tree. And he says that fruit tree, it didn't produce any fruit for 3 years. And he said he'd give it another year, but if it still produced no fruit, that he would cut it down because it's just using up the ground. And it's been 3 years since Jesus has been looking for fruit from the religious leaders from the last time that he came and he cleansed the temple. And he's seen no fruit in the religion that the Jewish leaders were practicing. So I believe Jesus here, he's exposing the hypocrisy of the Jewish religious system, God's fig tree. Because with its beauty, with that big, beautiful Jewish temple, with all the people coming and going, and with all of its wealth, it looked as if it was prospering. It looked as if it was healthy, but there wasn't any fruit there. But if you were hungry, if you're hungry for God, and you saw all this religious activity going on at the temple, you would think that you would go there and that you would be spiritually fed. You would think God is there. But it's just like this fruit tree. It only boasted of having great health, these big, beautiful leaves, but it had no fruit. So after your search and you find this tree with all these leaves, you would always just leave hungry. You wouldn't find God there. You have to realize that fig trees, they're not grown for their beauty. They're not grown for their leaves. Fig trees are grown for their fruit. And so Jesus here, he's demonstrating what he previously taught in this parable in Luke 13, and that he's going to cut down this Jewish religious system, which is going to happen in 70 AD. Now, just like Israel was supposed to produce fruit, we too, as Christians, we're supposed to produce fruit. And if we belong to Jesus, we will produce fruit. But if we stop bearing fruit, God, he's not going to come and he's not going to destroy us like the fig tree. But what could happen is that God could take his blessing from our lives. He could take his presence from us. He'll never leave us, but we can lose our intimacy with him. And it's just like Jesus told the church of Ephesus in the book of Revelation about when he would remove his lampstand, which meant that they would lose his light and his presence. And the thing is, we can lose those kind of things too. And it says that happened to them because they lost their first love.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,